Who likes cake? What kind of cakes? Chocolate cake. Any others? Well, I love chocolate. I love German chocolate cake, and I really like cheesecake. Some people might remember the Chase had the tack room. They had this great cheesecake. Anybody ever had that? Oh, it was delicious. But who's ever made a cake? I mean from scratch, not taking a box, and it's a lot of work, isn't it? But you have to follow that recipe because there are specific ingredients that go in at specific times in specific amounts. You do specific things to them, and you get a great cake. Well, it's the same thing with the content of a presentation. There is a recipe for it, if you would. So going forward, I'm going to talk about that component of a presentation, the content. I'm going to give the parts. I'm going to name them, explain them, give some examples. I've got time to set aside for questions, and then I'll conclude the presentation. But before we start, the bottom line of all communication, written, visual, or speaking, I guess, is that the audience, as quickly as possible, gets it. Now, they don't have to agree with everything you say. They don't have to agree with anything, but if they don't get it, you can't have a conversation going forward. Make sense? Who's in Toastmasters or had some presentation skills training? Good. Toastmasters is great. Well, we learned in a presentation there are two components, content and delivery. Content is the message. Delivery is presenting that message. Well, today we're going to talk about content. And usually we learn that in content there is an opening, body, and a conclusion. Tell the audience what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Make sense? What's often overlooked, though, is the title and the introduction, and also how you handle Q&A. We're going to talk about content. And it starts with the title. The title of your presentation should be like the marquee of a theater, the headline of a newspaper article, the spine of a book, or the subject line of an email. Because if the title of the theater doesn't grab you, you won't go in to see it. The headline of the newspaper article, you won't read it. The spine of the book, you won't take it off the shelf. And the subject line of an email, you won't open it. Example, I could have called my signature presentation Speaking 101. How to give a presentation. I thought no sweat public speaking has a little more emotion to it. Does that make sense? So the title is extremely important. The introduction, and Ann, thank you for giving me that picture of Bill. A handsome young man, wasn't he? I'll tell you.
Had hair too.
But the introduction is an integral part of the presentation, and it is not your bio. No one cares where you went to school, how many kids you have, where you went to vacation, what you collect in terms of maybe stamps or rocks. The introduction should be written by the speaker. It should be given to the MC before they present it. It's completely your responsibility as a speaker. And it answers three questions. Why this subject? Why this speaker? And why now? It is not a point to be modest. Because far better a third party says great things about you than you get up because it would seem braggadocious. So in this case, why the subject? Speaking opportunities are business, career, and leadership opportunities. Why this speaker? I've got a lot of experience doing it. And why now? Well, we all agree, speaking opportunities are business, career, and leadership opportunities. It's an integral part of the presentation, extremely important. Now, the opening of the presentation should do two things. Should be a strong opening, and then that grabs your attention, and then tell the audience what you're going to tell them. So in this case, hopefully asking who likes cake was sort of a pattern interrupt and got your attention, and then we had the analogy going into the recipe for a presentation, the recipe for a cake. And you tell people what you're going to tell them. Give them the roadmap of what you're going to say so they know what it is. The body of the speech has a formula, and the formula is make a point, tell a story. Make a point, tell a story. 3 to 5 points per speech. So as an example, well, first of all, we love stories, don't we? I mean, we're storytellers. Before there was printing, we used to tell stories to pass on history. I remember being a kid, listening to stories that my grandfather would tell me. Well, now I am a grandfather, so I'm telling those stories. Let me give you an example. If I were talking about the 3 P's of selling, product knowledge, prospecting, and persistence, I would make each of those points and tell a story. And maybe I'm talking about persistence. Don't give up. You know, sales is a process, not an event. And maybe I tell the story about Thomas Edison. The story about Thomas Edison is that it took him 10,000 experiments to invent the light bulb. And a reporter once asked him, so Mr. Edison, how do you feel about having failed so many times? And he said, well, I never did. I successfully found a lot of ways it didn't work. Now that's a great persistence story. Who's heard that story before? I heard it twice in one day. 2 speakers back to back. It's a great story, but it's not your story. Well, the cure for that is to tell your own story. Each and every one of you, we heard some great stories from Karen today. Each and every one of you have your own stories of persistence, overcoming obstacles, swimming upstream when people are coming downstream. And the key is to be, as they say in yoga, talk about yoga, always present and in the moment. And when those stories occur real time, you capture them and put them in the hard drive of your brain, so when you need to make a point and support that with a story, you have that story. Let me tell you a story. One of the things I talk about is that you have to have backups. You have to have some spare tires in case things go south. I'm a Mac guy, and I've got this backed up on a thumb drive. I've got it backed up on Keynote, which is the program I use. I've got it backed up in PowerPoint, but Bill's PowerPoint is a different version. I've got it backed up in a PDF. So I've got all bases covered, plus I print out my slides. I use mostly images, and I've got it all printed out. Well, here's my story. I'm at the Town and Country Chamber, Fenton Chamber lunch meeting, their chamber. I'm talking about presentations. And I'm on my 10th slide of 21, and the screen looks like this. Well, my computer's working, the projector's working, it's a luncheon meeting, no time to reboot. So I'm thinking, well, I better pull out my spare tire and pull out my spare tire. I had not practiced with it though. And I'm thinking at the time, this is going to be a great story someday. And it's a good thing I was wearing a black shirt. It was almost big sweat instead of no sweat. Well, I pull out my spare tire and I tell the story. Now I tell that story all the time because it occurred. And that's the key. And we all have those things occurring. Nobody else can tell your story unless you've given them permission. So here's my backup. I always print out these slides. I think it's slide sorter view in PowerPoint. It's light table view in Keynote. And this is a great spare tire to have. But you want to make sure that tire has air in it and practice changing it before you go into the desert. Questions. Let me talk about handling questions. First of all, have you ever been to a presentation and the guy goes, oh my gosh, I got 5 minutes left and 15 slides. Hold on. Anyone ever been there? Yeah. Well, that's why when I opened the presentation, I told what I was going to do. And I said I'll be taking questions before my closing. That's when you should take them. Or if you have a longer presentation than this is going to be, you take them in sections, but you want to limit them. If you take questions as you go along, I'm not that good at time management, but you can mess up your whole presentation. So if in my opening, Jared raises his hand and said, hey Fred, what's the best way to close a presentation? Am I going to answer that? No, you don't want to do that. You want to tell people when you're going to take the questions. And rarely, as I did in my opening, telling them when I was going to take it, do I get hands. And if I do, I say, do me a big favor, write that down. If I don't cover it, be sure to ask me in the Q&A. So it's very important in terms of handling questions, unless you have unlimited time and you can control it. Whoops. Another thing about questions is how you ask for them. This guy's got a question, right? You don't want to say, do you have any questions? Because people are sitting there thinking, yeah, I got questions, but man, nobody else is raising their hand. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. I don't want to embarrass myself. Anybody ever felt like that? A better way to ask is, what questions do you have for me? But making that even better is, what questions do you have for me? When you raise your hand, more hands will go up. But you want to be able to prime the pump too. I always carry a few questions in my back pocket. People are usually a little bit shy about asking questions. Be sure to have those. And you don't want to say, as I did to Dale earlier today, you don't want to say, good question. Because if I say, Tom, good question. Good question. What am I going to say, Karen, if you ask me a question? Better to say, thanks for asking. Or just answer the question. Most people just say, oh, great question, good question. Don't want to do that. When you answer that question, if Kathy would ask me, I look her in the eye, I finish the thought, I move on to someone else, finish the thought, move on to someone else, finish the thought, finish that question. Because if Kathy asks me a question and I look at her during the whole time I'm answering the question, well, she'll have a follow-up question, and I'll answer that. And we're in a conversation. You want to include everyone in that. You don't want to throw it out to the audience. I did that once, and actually it was Chris Robinson came up to me after the presentation and said, can I give you some advice? The problem with throwing it out to the audience, first of all, you're losing control of the meeting. You don't know if they're going to give the right answer. You don't know how long they're going to take. It's best if you don't remember the answer or you don't know it, is to say, I'm drawing a blank right now. If I can't think of that answer before we're finished with the questions, do me a big favor, catch me afterwards, and we'll figure it out. Do not throw it out to someone else. I like that slide. I just made that this morning. All right, now the closing. The closing is the opposite of the opening. You tell people what you told them, and then you have a strong closing. Maybe a motivational quote, a challenge, a call to action, something like that. Well, when I started the presentation, and I gave the order of everything, I said I had time set aside for questions. This is that time. What questions do you have for me? I'm going to ask the first question. Because one of the questions I'm always asked is, why do you take questions now? Because traditionally, the speaker finishes, the host comes up, says, thank you very much. Could you stick around for some questions? And I do. But here's the problem. There's a rule in giving presentations called the law of primacy and recency. The audience best remembers the first and last things they see and hear. That's why you want to have a strong opening and a strong closing. And more the strong closing, because the last thing you see and hear me say is going to be the first thing you remember. But say I'm doing it the traditional way, and I'm taking the questions, they're going pretty good, and I've got time for one more. And Will says, Fred, that thing you said about write your own introduction, what a bunch of garbage. And take questions before you close, that's garbage. In fact, your presentation is so full of garbage, it stinks. Well, time's up. It's not the takeaway I want you leaving with. Even if it's true. All right, what questions do you have? Does this make sense to everyone?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, a lot of what I do, it's kind of flashes of the obvious. What, Bill?
Fred, because I know you go to a lot of presentations in addition to giving them, what would you say is the thing that you see people, presenters do that you kind of like cringe and, but you see it a lot?
Oh, that's a whole other presentation. But sometimes not having the right structure. I saw Martin Sheehan speak, part of the Maryville Speaker Series. There is a difference between speaking and acting. I mean, the first thing he did, he said, boy, this is people's greatest fear. And when he was giving his presentation, he was certainly good, but he lost track and he's going through his papers. But when he got into doing some acting, he was outstanding. But if I'm going to give two pieces of advice, the silver nugget for giving presentations and lessening the fear of public speaking is practice, practice, practice. And the golden nugget is speak, speak, speak. There's no easy way. There's no magic pill that helps you do it. Tom.
Fred, I've seen a lot of your presentations, and you're image heavy on the slides. Talk about the strategy behind images versus the more traditional.
Thanks for asking. It was a good question, too. All right, we have three learning styles. Visual, that's most people. Auditory, that's second most. And kinesthetic is the third. If you can appeal to two of those, and we're talking about visual, I'm providing the text with my voice, that increases the odds the audience gets it. And let me talk about bullet points for a moment. The problem with bullet points, and I've made all the mistakes, the problem with bullet points is we cannot multitask. Because if I've got bullet points up here, I'm reading here, you're reading here, and there's a disconnect. You don't get it. Bullet points do not reinforce a message. They complicate the message, they confuse the audience, and they conflict with the presentation. I prove this all the time. I've got Steve Jobs' book on my iPad, and I'm listening to the book. I really like it. And I'll think, well, let me check my email. Well, let me surf a little bit. Every time I go back to the book, I have to rewind. Now, blanking the screen, let me mention that. When I blank the screen, where do you look? Yeah. How many presentations have you been to? Presenter didn't have to be there. Lots of them. This is just a tool, and it helps the audience get it. And again, if the bottom line of all communication, verbal, written, or visual, is that we want the audience to get it, that's the way to do it. You know, simple language also. Yes?
As a result, after my presentation to the group 3 weeks ago, you came up to me and you said that very thing. You said, you know, first of all, turn off the blank the screen between. I've done that twice, following your advice, and I also bought a remote, and I will tell you the difference is dramatic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I know the first time I did, I guess I was standing a little bit to the side. I mean, the whole audience shifted, and I thought, oh my gosh, this works. And you're right about the remote, because and that's why I brought this, because if I kept going up here and hitting that button, it's very distracting. And the whole idea in the presentation is clean, simple, Zen-like. I take off my name tag. It's clutter. And I learned that because a guy sent me a book to review, and he said, take off your name tag. Gosh, that's Big Fred. That's part of my branding. I can't believe he said that. But watch some TED videos. The lady who spoke last night, Julia Gillard, she was the Prime Minister in Australia, part of the speaker series again. No necklace, no bling, tremendous speaker, but I would suggest to her to improve on, she had this lectern. And she's standing in back of the lectern. And she was very animated, because we get into another presentation on delivery, and delivery does trump content. Nonverbal trumps verbal, and she was very animated. Great expressions on her face. And to your point, if you've got these great expressions, and I'm showing things with my hands and body language, and they're looking at the screen because we're drawn to the light, that takes away from it. Jared.
Yeah, can you talk about how you practice a little bit? Meaning, do you actually write everything out?
No.
Do you bullet points?
No,
Do you
no, I
use
don't.
emotions?
Thanks for asking. Good question. Well, I use mind maps, and mind maps are a nonlinear visual brainstorming tool. And if you put the pictures up there, it's so much easier. I mean, every one of those images, I can tell you the story. And it's a lot easier to do that way. You know, let me give you an example. I was talking to a lady yesterday. I'm going to coach her. She has a fear of public speaking, and I'm remembering a presentation I give on that topic. And one of the first images, it's a mouth with a zipper over it. And I said, don't get up and tell people you have a fear of public speaking. I've seen people do that. Oh, I hate this. I didn't practice. Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you have the image, I know that story. So I use mind maps to develop, practice, and deliver presentations. Practice into a recorder, practice into a mirror, practice different ways. Because I've heard people talk about they'll videotape themselves, they get real good, and they get up in front of a live audience, and whoa, you know, it's different. Yeah, but practicing is the key. And the example I give, you know, we had the Olympics up in Sochi recently. Does anybody think those great athletes just showed up? No, they dedicated years of their life to that sport. Any other questions? All right, well, I've got a gift for everyone before I close. If you want, I've got the speaker's template, and I'll email it to you. Some of you have this, but just email me, fred@nosweatpublicspeaking.com. I'll email this to you. And I've got an elevator speech template and a worksheet. I'll email that too. Now it's time to close the presentation. In the closing, we review, tell you what we talked about. We talked about the components of a presentation. We talked about content. And you start with the title, and then you go to the introduction. Write your own introduction. Don't be modest there. Very, very important. Have an opening where you grab the attention of the audience, tell them what you're going to tell them. The body of the speech has a formula. Make a point, tell a story, personal stories. It was amazing how many people knew the story about Edison here. Yeah, and I've seen people do. And here again, if I hadn't raised my hand, some people would have been polite and kept their hands down. And then in the closing, review what you told them, and then have a strong closing. So let me close with a challenge and a prediction. Here's my challenge, and it's to each and every one of you. Get that speaker's template. Develop, practice, and deliver your presentation using that template. Do that, and my prediction is this. Your next presentation, the next talk you give, your next speech will be absolutely, positively, there's no doubt in my mind, that presentation will be no sweat.